Mark had always loved being alone in nature. It was his escape from the constant buzz of the city. The peace of the forest, with its tall trees and endless green, made him feel free, alive, and connected to something bigger than himself. He had spent countless weekends hiking, camping, and fishing in the wild, but this time was different. This time, he was deep in the forest, miles away from civilization, alone for a week to test his survival skills. The sun was beginning to set on his second day, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Mark had set up his camp by a small, bubbling creek. The air was fresh, the water cool, and the sound of rustling leaves surrounded him. He felt at peace, except for one small thing. It was that feeling, that nagging sensation in the back of his mind that something wasn't quite right. He paused as he was setting up his tent, scanning the surrounding trees. The forest seemed quiet, too quiet. The usual sounds of birds and insects were missing. He shrugged it off, blaming it on his own imagination. After all, he had hiked through much denser forests before. Why would this one be any different? As he continued his work, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching him. He turned around quickly, but there was nothing there. The trees stood still, their branches swaying only slightly in the evening breeze. His heart rate picked up a bit. He laughed at himself nervously. Maybe it was just the isolation getting to him. He was out here alone, after all, and the mind could play tricks when you had no one to talk to. That night, after a simple dinner of beans and rice, Mark sat by his small campfire, watching the flames flicker and dance. The light cast long shadows on the forest floor, making the trees appear like silent giants watching over him. He stared into the fire, letting his thoughts wander, but the strange feeling was still there, tugging at him. He glanced around the camp, his eyes moving over the trees and the darkened trail behind him. That's when he saw it, a flash of movement. At first, he thought it was just an animal, perhaps a deer or a raccoon, but it didn't move like any animal he'd ever seen. The figure was too still, too quiet. Mark's breath caught in his chest. He strained his eyes to see better in the dim light, but the figure quickly disappeared behind a thick tree. Was it a person? No, that couldn't be right. He was miles away from any hiking trail or campground. No one else would be out here. His heart began to race. Mark reached for his flashlight, holding it in his hand, unsure whether he should call out or remain silent. Something told him calling out would be a mistake. He stayed still, waiting, listening. The rustling sound came again, closer this time, but it wasn't from the direction he expected. It was coming from behind him. He turned around sharply. Nothing. The forest was silent once more. Mark's breath slowed, but his pulse remained quick. He stood up, scanning the area once again. The glowing eyes he thought he had seen before were gone, but that didn't make him feel any safer. Something was off. He wasn't alone, and he had no idea what was out there. Mark made a decision then. He wasn't going to let fear control him. If it was an animal, he would be fine. If it was something else, well, he would have to figure it out. He took a deep breath, then stood, grabbing a stick and walking slowly toward the edge of the camp where he had seen the movement. He felt foolish, like a child afraid of monsters, but the instinct to protect himself kept him moving. Just as he neared the tree where he had seen the movement, he froze. There, in the shadows, was the unmistakable outline of a figure, tall, slender, and standing still as if it had been waiting for him. Mark's heart stopped. The figure didn't seem threatening at first, but there was something about its presence that made him uneasy. Before he could take another step, the figure turned quickly and vanished into the trees. Mark stood there, rooted to the spot, his mind racing. What had just happened? Who or what was out there? His breath quickened again, and for the first time, he wished he wasn't alone. He knew something had been watching him. He just didn't know what it was. Mark quickly returned to the campfire, his mind spinning with questions. He tried to focus on what he had seen, But the image of that mysterious figure, slender, almost otherworldly, kept coming back to him. He wasn't alone in the forest, and now, more than ever, he needed to figure out who, or what, was out there. The night was far from over, and Mark had a feeling that whatever was watching him wasn't going to stay hidden for long. The next day, Mark woke to the soft light of dawn filtering through the canopy of trees above him. The eerie feeling from the night before still hung in the air, thick as fog, but he forced himself to push it aside. After all, he couldn't let something as strange as a brief encounter ruin his trip. Nature had a way of playing tricks on the mind, especially when one was out here alone for so long. He made breakfast, instant oatmeal, and a cup of coffee from his small camp stove. The forest was alive with its usual sounds now: birds chirping, insects buzzing, and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. He almost felt foolish for being so jumpy the night before, but the memory of those strange eyes kept creeping back into his mind. What had he seen? Was it an animal? Had he just imagined it in the dark? Mark shook his head, trying to clear the thoughts. He needed to focus on the task at hand, surviving and enjoying the beauty around him. He had hiked far enough into the wilderness that he was sure he wouldn't come across any other humans, but that didn't bother him. This was what he had wanted: peace and solitude, away from everything. As he finished eating, he decided to explore the area around his camp. He needed to calm his nerves, get a better sense of the land, and make sure he wasn't imagining things. He grabbed his pack and set off down a narrow trail, following the creek that wound its way through the forest. The water bubbled over the rocks, a soft, calming sound that helped ease his mind. He walked for hours, losing track of time as he admired the natural beauty around him. Towering trees stretched high into the sky, their branches thick with leaves. Bright wildflowers grew along the path, adding splashes of color to the rich green landscape. It was the kind of place people dream of, a peaceful, untouched paradise. But as the day wore on, that feeling returned. The hair on the back of his neck stood up again, and the hairs on his arms tingled with a sense of being watched. This time, it was stronger, more intense. Mark quickened his pace, trying to shake the feeling, but it only grew. He was no longer alone. He had no idea why he felt this way, but the deep primal part of his brain was telling him to be alert. The forest around him seemed to grow quieter, and the air felt heavier, almost electric. As he rounded a bend in the creek, he saw it again, the flash of movement, just beyond his line of sight. Mark froze. He wasn't imagining it this time. There, standing behind a thick tree, was the same figure he had seen last night. Only this time, it wasn't just an outline. He could see more clearly now. The figure was tall and slim, with glowing skin that shimmered in the dappled sunlight. It wasn't human. There was no mistaking it. His heart pounded in his chest as he stared at the figure, unsure of what to do next. Should he call out? Should he run? But before he could make up his mind, the figure stepped forward into the light. Mark's breath caught in his throat. It was a girl. No, not just a girl. An alien. Her features were delicate, almost ethereal, with wide violet eyes that seemed to glow faintly. Her hair shimmered like strands of silver, and her skin had a soft, iridescent hue, like moonlight reflecting off the ocean. Mark's mind raced. What was she? Where did she come from? Was she the one watching him? The girl didn't speak, but her presence felt like a question, like she was waiting for something from him. Mark swallowed hard. He couldn't move, couldn't speak. The fear that had been building in his chest now mixed with awe. The reality of what he was seeing hit him like a wave. This was no dream. This was real. And yet, the girl didn't seem threatening. Her posture was relaxed, even curious. She took a cautious step closer, her violet eyes never leaving Mark's. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, as if neither of them knew what to make of the situation. Then, slowly, the girl extended her hand toward him, her fingers delicate and graceful. She didn't say a word, but her eyes, those mesmerizing eyes, spoke volumes. She was scared. She wasn't just some curious being. She was lost, and she needed help. Mark's heart softened. Despite the shock of seeing an alien in front of him, he felt an overwhelming sense of empathy. She wasn't a threat. She was just as lost as he was, maybe even more so. "Are you okay?" Mark asked, his voice hoarse. It was a ridiculous question, but it felt like the right thing to say. The girl tilted her head, as if trying to understand the words. She didn't respond, but she took another step closer. Mark hesitated, then made a decision. He slowly stepped forward, extending his hand as well. The moment their hands touched, something strange happened. A wave of warmth and energy passed between them. Mark felt it, a deep connection, almost like a surge of understanding. The girl's eyes widened slightly, and for the first time, she seemed to relax. She had been waiting for something. Someone, perhaps for him. Mark knew that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't even imagine. Mark didn't know what to make of what had just happened. The moment his hand had touched hers, a strange warmth had spread through his entire body. It wasn't just a physical sensation. It was as if the connection went deeper, into his very core. He pulled his hand back, his heart still racing from the strange encounter. The girl was standing still, her violet eyes watching him closely. The silence between them felt heavy, thick with the weight of unspoken words. Mark had no idea how to communicate with her. She wasn't speaking, and her body language was foreign to him. She wasn't threatening, but the uncertainty was like a cloud hanging over them both. Mark took a deep breath and stepped back. "I don't know what's going on here, but are you all right?" The girl didn't respond. Instead, she slowly turned her head to look around, her gaze moving in every direction, as if she were listening for something. Mark followed her gaze but saw nothing, just the trees, the creek, and the distant rustle of leaves. Whatever she was looking for, it wasn't in his line of sight. He felt his pulse quicken again. "Are you lost?" Mark asked, unsure if she even understood him. The girl's eyes flicked back to him for a brief moment, then returned to scanning the area. She wasn't looking at him as much as she was looking for something or someone. Mark felt a sense of urgency in her movements. Whatever she was searching for, she seemed desperate. She turned away from him, moving swiftly, but not in a way that seemed threatening. It was almost as if she was gliding through the forest, her steps silent against the forest floor. Mark hesitated, unsure if he should follow her or stay put. The rational part of his mind told him to stay at his camp and wait, but there was another part of him, the part that had always been curious, always wanted to explore, that urged him to follow. Without thinking, Mark stepped forward, his feet crunching the leaves underfoot. The girl heard him. She stopped and turned, her eyes locking with his again. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, neither one moving. Mark swallowed hard, the tension thick between them. He felt like there was something important happening, something that went beyond the strange encounter in the forest. He had no idea what she was, but he couldn't just leave her out there alone. He spoke again, softer this time. "I'm not going to hurt you." The girl's eyes softened, and for a moment, Mark thought she might speak. But she didn't. Instead, she gave a tiny nod, as if acknowledging his words in her own way. She took a few steps back, then started walking slowly into the trees, as though beckoning him to follow. Mark took a deep breath and decided to trust her. If she was leading him somewhere, he had no choice but to follow. He had no idea what he was getting into, but he knew he couldn't just let her disappear into the woods again. He followed her, keeping a safe distance, careful not to make any sudden movements. The girl moved through the forest with ease, as if she had lived there her entire life. Mark struggled to keep up, his eyes darting from one tree to the next, trying to avoid tripping over roots or branches. Yet, despite the uneven terrain, the girl never stumbled. She seemed to glide effortlessly over the forest floor. The farther they went, the deeper into the woods they traveled. The trees grew taller, their trunks thick and ancient, their branches reaching out like arms to shield them from the outside world. The air grew cooler, and the sunlight filtered through the leaves in slanted beams, casting eerie shadows on the ground. Mark couldn't help but notice the strange sense of calm that seemed to surround the girl. Even though he was following her into unknown territory, he didn't feel afraid. Not really. The fear he had felt earlier, when he thought he was being watched, had faded. Now, all he could feel was an overwhelming sense of curiosity. He watched as the girl paused in front of a large moss-covered rock. She placed a hand against it, her fingers brushing the rough surface, as if she were testing something. Mark stopped behind her, his eyes wide with wonder. The girl seemed to be waiting for something, and Mark felt the urge to speak. The girl didn't respond. Instead, she turned her head slightly, glancing at him over her shoulder. Her eyes met his once more, and for a brief moment, Mark saw something in her gaze, something that seemed almost sad. It was as if she had been waiting for a long time, hoping for something she hadn't yet found. Then, without a word, she turned back to the rock. Her hand moved across the surface, and Mark felt a strange vibration in the air. It was subtle at first, but it grew stronger as the girl pressed harder against the stone. Suddenly, there was a soft, almost imperceptible hum, followed by a faint light that began to glow beneath her hand. Mark stepped forward, his curiosity getting the better of him. "What is this?" The girl didn't answer, but as the light grew brighter, Mark realized that the rock wasn't just a rock. It was something else. Something alive. His mind raced as he tried to understand what he was seeing. Was this part of her world? Was she a part of something bigger? And more importantly, what was she waiting for? Before Mark could ask another question, the ground beneath them began to tremble, and the sound of distant footsteps reached his ears. Someone, or something, was coming. Mark's pulse quickened as the ground trembled beneath his feet. The faint hum of energy from the stone seemed to grow louder, almost as if it were responding to something. The girl, standing still with her hand against the rock, seemed to sense it too. Her eyes widened, and she jerked her head toward the direction of the sound, distant but unmistakable. Something was coming. The air around them grew heavier, the silence of the forest replaced by the pounding of distant footsteps, each one seemingly getting closer. Mark's heart raced as he glanced over his shoulder, trying to spot anything that could explain the noise. He didn't see anything, but the sound was undeniable. Whatever it was moving fast, heading straight toward them. The girl's expression shifted, her calm, otherworldly demeanor faded, replaced by an urgent look of fear. She pulled her hand away from the stone, quickly stepping back. Her eyes locked with Mark's, and for the first time, he saw a clear emotion in her gaze, a plea for help. Mark didn't need any more clues. He knew something dangerous was coming, and it was after her. "What's happening?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. The girl didn't speak, but she grabbed his wrist with surprising strength, pulling him away from the stone and deeper into the forest. Mark stumbled behind her, his feet moving quickly to keep up, though his mind was racing. Who were these people, or whatever they were, that were coming for her? What did they want? As they sprinted through the trees, Mark's mind flashed back to everything he had seen in the past few days. The strange figure in the shadows, the warmth from her touch, and now this. He had no idea who or what the girl was, but it was clear that she was in danger. The sound of the footsteps grew louder, the rhythm unmistakable. Mark could feel his chest tighten with panic. The girl's grip on his wrist tightened too, as if she could sense his fear. He glanced at her as they ran, but her face was hard to read. Focused, determined, but also, he noticed, exhausted. She was used to running, used to hiding. They reached a thick thicket of trees, and the girl suddenly stopped, pulling him behind a large boulder. Mark crouched low, trying to steady his breath, though his heart was still racing. His eyes scanned the forest around them. The sound of footsteps was so close now, he could almost feel the ground vibrating beneath his feet. The hunters were near. "Where are they?" Mark whispered, unable to stop himself. "Who are they?" The girl didn't answer. Instead, she pressed her fingers to her lips, signaling for him to stay silent. Mark nodded, understanding that speaking could give them away. His eyes darted nervously toward the sound. His muscles tensed, ready to run or fight, whatever he needed to do. Then, through the trees, they emerged. A group of figures, tall, armored beings with sleek black suits and glowing red eyes, stepped into view. Their movement was synchronized, as if they were part of some well-trained unit. Mark's stomach churned. He had never seen anything like them before. They looked humanoid, but their appearance was too alien to be mistaken for any human soldier. Their armor reflected the faint light filtering through the trees, and their weapons, a strange, energy-based rifle, glowed faintly in their hands. The girl beside him stiffened, her eyes wide with fear. Mark could see the terror on her face, and he knew she was in serious trouble. The hunters moved forward, their red eyes scanning the area, seemingly aware that something was off. One of them stopped, crouching down and examining the ground. The air felt thick with tension as the others spread out, fanning out into the trees. Mark held his breath, praying they wouldn't notice him or the girl. The leader of the group, taller than the others, with a darker suit and a sharp, angular helmet, stepped forward. He held his weapon tightly, ready to fire at any moment. Mark felt a chill run down his spine. These weren't people looking for someone to talk to. They were hunters, and they were on a mission. "Where is she?" The leader barked, his voice metallic and harsh. Mark could see that the hunters were communicating with each other through some kind of device in their helmets. They were using signals, coordinating their movements to track the girl. The girl beside him flinched at the sound of the leader's voice, her face pale with fear. Mark's mind raced, trying to think of a way out of this. If these hunters were after her, it meant she was in grave danger. He didn't know what to do. He was just a regular guy, a camper, lost in a forest. But something inside him told him that he couldn't just stand by. He couldn't let them take her. He looked around quickly, spotting a small path that led deeper into the woods. It wasn't much, but it was something. The hunters hadn't noticed it yet. If they made a move now, they might just have a chance. Mark turned to the girl, his eyes wide with urgency. "We need to run. Now." Without waiting for her to respond, he grabbed her hand again and pulled her toward the path. The girl hesitated for just a moment, looking back at the hunters, but then she ran with him, her speed almost inhuman, her footsteps barely making a sound as she moved through the trees. Behind them, the hunters shouted, realizing what was happening. The chase was on. Mark's heart pounded in his chest as he and the girl sprinted through the dense forest. The sound of the hunters' footsteps grew louder behind them, and the weight of their pursuit pressed down on him, making every second feel like a lifetime. He could hear the hunters calling to each other in their harsh, metallic voices, but Mark didn't dare look back. He focused only on the girl's speed, matching her pace as best he could. The forest seemed to blur around them, the tall trees flashing past like dark sentinels. The ground beneath their feet was uneven, with roots and rocks jutting out, but the girl moved with grace, her feet barely touching the ground. Mark tried to keep up, but his legs burned with the effort. He wasn't as fast as she was, and he could feel himself slowing down with each step. "Come on, keep up," the girl urged, glancing over her shoulder for just a second. Her voice was soft but urgent, and Mark could see the fear in her eyes. He had no idea how long she had been running from these hunters, but he knew it had to be exhausting for her. Mark's breath came in ragged gasps. "I'm trying," he said, his voice strained. They rounded a sharp bend, and Mark stumbled, almost losing his footing. The girl reached out and steadied him with a firm grip. She didn't slow down. She couldn't. There was no time. He wasn't sure where she was leading him, but he trusted her. At least he had to. There was no other choice. The forest was becoming denser, the trees growing closer together, their branches thick with leaves. The air smelled earthy and damp, but Mark barely noticed it. The only thing that mattered was staying ahead of the hunters. Behind them, the sound of pursuit continued, louder now. Mark could hear the whirring of the hunters' equipment and the harsh crackle of their voices through the comms. They were getting closer. Their voices were no longer distant shouts. They were right behind them, closing in with each passing second. Mark pushed himself harder, willing his legs to move faster. The girl darted ahead, weaving between trees with ease, her body barely making a sound. He tried to match her, but it was hard. His muscles ached, and every step felt like it took more effort than the last. "Go! Now!" the girl called out, and Mark saw her reach a large rock formation ahead. It was a narrow gap between two towering stones, just wide enough for them to slip through. She reached it first and stopped, turning to face him. "Through here," she urged. Mark reached her just as the first hunter's voice called out from behind them. "They're close. Keep moving." Without thinking, Mark ducked into the gap between the rocks, his heart racing. He heard the girl follow him, her footsteps light and quick. The narrow passage was dark, and the air was thick with the smell of moss and earth. Mark's breath came in quick bursts as he tried to adjust his eyes to the dim light. He could hear the girl moving ahead of him, her steps sure, as though she knew this place. They emerged into a small, hidden clearing, a strange, quiet place far removed from the frantic chase. The sunlight barely reached the ground, casting long shadows over the area. The girl didn't stop. She darted toward a thick patch of ferns and crouched low, signaling for Mark to follow. Mark hurried to join her, but the sound of the hunter's pursuit was still close. He could hear their footsteps and their harsh breathing. The girl's violet eyes scanned the area, her head tilting slightly as if she were listening for something else. Something beyond the hunter's sounds. "They're almost here," she whispered urgently, her voice filled with tension. Mark could feel the weight of her fear, and it only made his heart race faster. He wanted to ask her where they could hide, but the words caught in his throat. The girl turned to him, her gaze sharp and focused. She grabbed his wrist again, her grip firm but not painful. "Stay still. Don't make a sound." Mark nodded, his own heartbeat thumping loudly in his chest. He barely dared to breathe. The forest felt suffocating, the quiet growing unbearable. His eyes darted from one side of the clearing to the other, searching for anything that might help them escape. But there was nothing. No other hiding places, no way out. They were trapped here, at least for the moment. Suddenly, the sound of heavy footsteps reached their ears. The hunters had found the gap between the rocks. Mark's breath caught in his throat. He could hear their low voices, sharp and angry, as they began searching the clearing. Their glowing red eyes flashed through the trees, casting an eerie light on everything around them. Mark could feel their gaze pass over them, and his heart skipped a beat. They were so close. The girl didn't move, but her body was tense, every muscle coiled and ready. She wasn't afraid of them. No, it was something else, something deeper. She was preparing for what would come next. And then, just as suddenly as they had come, the hunters stopped. Mark barely dared to breathe, praying they hadn't heard the slightest sound. For what felt like an eternity, the forest was silent. The girl's grip on his wrist tightened, and she slowly began to move backward, pulling him with her. Mark followed her lead, staying low to the ground as they moved quietly, step by step, away from the hunters. With each passing second, they got farther away from danger, their presence slipping into the forest's shadows. Mark couldn't see the hunters anymore, but the girl didn't slow down. They needed to put as much distance between them and the danger as possible. Mark glanced over at her. The girl's face was determined, but there was something else in her eyes, a deep sadness. She had been running for so long. He wasn't sure if he could help her, but one thing was clear: she wasn't giving up. Neither was he. Mark and the girl moved deeper into the forest, their steps slow and deliberate as they tried to stay hidden from the hunters. The sound of pursuit had faded, but Mark knew it wasn't over. The hunters were still out there, still searching for them. His chest tightened with every footstep, but he didn't dare speak. The girl, who had led him through the forest with an almost unnatural ease, now seemed to be taking extra care, as though she knew every tree and every path in the woods. The forest around them grew darker as they traveled, the canopy thick above them. Mark had lost track of time. How long had they been running? Hours. It felt like days. He could feel the weight of exhaustion in his legs, but he didn't stop. The girl, however, showed no signs of slowing down. She moved like a shadow, slipping through the trees as if the forest itself was guiding her. They stopped in a small clearing where the light barely broke through the thick leaves above. The girl turned to face Mark, her violet eyes searching his face, as if looking for something he couldn't understand. "I need to know your name," Mark said quietly, his voice breaking the heavy silence. The words felt strange coming from him, but they were important. He needed to know more about her, who she was, where she came from. She had saved him from those hunters, and that connection, however brief, was more than he had ever experienced in the woods. "I didn't want to bring you into this," Zira said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "You should have stayed in the camp. I didn't want you to be a part of this." Mark stared at her in confusion. A part of what? Zira's gaze drifted to the trees again, her eyes distant. "A part of my world," she whispered. "But now, they'll never stop looking for you." Mark's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean? They're after me now too?" Zira nodded slowly, her face grim. "They're not just after me. They've been watching you since you arrived. The moment you came into the forest, they knew. And now," she trailed off, her voice laced with sorrow, "now they'll never stop." Mark felt the weight of her words. The hunters weren't just after Zira. They were after him too. The forest had never felt so alien before, so full of danger. His mind raced, trying to process everything, but it all felt like too much. "We need to go," Zira said urgently, her hand gripping Mark's wrist once more. "It's not safe here. Not anymore." Mark nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. There was no time to question her further. They had to run. Again. The girl stared at him for a long time, her lips pressing together in thought. Then, with a soft exhale, she spoke. "My name is Zira," she said in a voice so quiet it was almost a whisper. Mark almost didn't hear it, but the moment the name left her lips, something inside him shifted. Zira. It felt familiar, as if he had known it all along. He couldn't explain why, but the name seemed important. "I'm Mark," he said, offering her a small, strained smile. "Thanks for saving me." Zira nodded, but there was no smile in return. Instead, her gaze drifted back to the trees around them, her eyes scanning the surroundings with a sharpness Mark couldn't quite match. Her expression was distant, as if her thoughts were miles away. "There's no time," she muttered to herself. "They'll find us. They always do." Mark didn't know what she meant by that, but he could feel the tension in her words. It was clear she had been running from these hunters for a long time. She wasn't just trying to escape them. She was trying to survive. "Who are they?" Mark asked, his voice low but filled with concern. "Why are they after you?" Zira hesitated, her gaze flicking briefly to him before turning away again. She didn't want to answer, and for a moment, Mark wasn't sure she would. "They're not human," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're something else." Mark frowned, struggling to understand. "Something else? What do you mean? Are they like you?" Zira's eyes met his, her expression unreadable. "I'm not like them. I don't belong with them." Mark took a deep breath, the weight of her words settling over him. She wasn't like them. Whoever they weren't human. And Zira, she wasn't just a lost traveler. She was different, in ways Mark couldn't fully comprehend. Before he could ask more questions, Zira stepped closer, her head turning toward the trees. She raised a finger to her lips, signaling for Mark to be quiet. Mark held his breath, his body tensing as he listened. The distant hum of the hunter's technology reached his ears, an eerie mechanical sound that made his skin crawl. Zira's face hardened with determination, and she motioned for Mark to follow her. Without a word, she moved toward the edge of the clearing, slipping back into the shadows of the forest. Mark didn't hesitate. He knew better than to question her. If she said they needed to move, it meant they had to. They walked quickly but silently, careful to avoid making any noise. Mark's mind raced. What had Zira said? The hunters weren't human. What did that mean for her? For him? Everything was happening so fast, and he was struggling to keep up with the changes. As they moved through the forest, the trees grew even thicker. Mark could feel the air growing cooler, the atmosphere becoming heavier. There was something about the forest now, something unfamiliar and strange. It felt as if they were being drawn into a place that wasn't quite a part of the world he knew. A part of him wanted to ask Zira more questions, to understand what was going on, but another part of him knew better than to disrupt the fragile quiet between them. Zira stopped suddenly, turning to face him. She looked at him intently, her violet eyes scanning his face, and for the first time, Mark saw something else in her expression, something almost like regret. The pressure of the hunt was closing in around them. Zira's grip on Mark's wrist tightened as she pulled him through the dense forest. The hunters were relentless, and the woods were no longer just a shelter from the outside world. They had become a labyrinth, a place of danger at every turn. Mark's mind raced, trying to understand what was happening, but the forest itself seemed to be shifting, as if it had a mind of its own, guiding them deeper into the unknown. Zira didn't pause for a moment, her feet moving as silently as possible over the forest floor, which was littered with fallen leaves and branches. Mark struggled to keep up, his legs aching from the hours of running. But he had no choice. He had to stay with her. "Where are we going?" Mark asked between breaths, his voice full of both fear and confusion. Zira didn't answer immediately. Her eyes scanned the trees around them, her expression unreadable. It wasn't until they reached a small clearing that she finally spoke. "There's a place," she said, her voice soft, almost like a secret, "a place where they can't find us. It's hidden. Only a few know of it." Mark could barely hear her over the pounding of his own heartbeat. But why? Why can't they find us? Zira's eyes flickered briefly to him, a mixture of sadness and resolve in her gaze. "Because it's not just the forest they're hunting. It's me. And anyone who helps me." Mark's stomach twisted at the weight of her words. He had helped her. And now he was caught in this. He wanted to ask more questions, but Zira's warning look told him there wasn't time. "Stay close," she whispered, pulling him toward a narrow path between two large rocks. "We're almost there." Mark felt a strange sense of unease as they moved down the hidden path, surrounded by the thick trees that loomed above them. The path was narrow and winding, making it difficult to see where they were going. The air felt cooler now, and the sounds of the forest, birds, insects, the wind, had all disappeared, leaving a haunting silence. They turned another corner, and suddenly the path opened up into a small, secluded valley. It looked untouched, as though no one had ever set foot in it. The trees here were taller and older, their trunks wide and twisted. Moss grew thick on the ground, and strange flowers, glowing faintly in the dim light, dotted the landscape. "This is it," Zira said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. She let go of Mark's wrist, but he stayed close to her, taking in the beauty of the hidden valley. There was something almost otherworldly about it, a feeling of peace mixed with something darker. Mark looked around, his eyes searching for any sign of danger. But everything seemed still, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. "What is this place?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Zira took a deep breath and turned to face him. "This is a place of refuge," she said. "It was built by my people, hidden from the hunters. Only those who know the way can find it. It's the one place they can't reach." Mark nodded slowly, trying to process what she was saying. It was clear this place meant a lot to her, but what was it really? And why had she brought him here? Zira's face softened for a moment, and she placed a hand on a nearby tree, her fingers brushing the rough bark. This place is safe. For now. Mark frowned. But for how long? They'll still come after us. Zira's gaze darkened. They won't stop. But if we stay here long enough, we might have a chance to find something. Something that can stop them. Mark blinked in surprise. Find something? What do you mean? Zira turned to face him fully now, her expression serious. I don't know exactly what it is, but I've been searching for it. A way to end this. To stop the hunters for good. Mark swallowed hard, the weight of her words settling in his chest. And you think it's here, in this forest? Zira nodded. It has to be. This place is older than the hunters. My people built it long ago, but they didn't just build it as a refuge. It's a key to something greater, something they've been trying to find for centuries. Mark didn't understand, but there was no time to question her further. The sound of movement in the distance broke through the silence of the valley, a sharp crack of a branch underfoot. Zira's head snapped to the side, her eyes narrowing with focus. They're getting closer, she whispered urgently, grabbing Mark's arm. We don't have much time. Mark's heart raced again, and he looked around, but there was nowhere to hide. The hunters were coming, and they had nowhere to go. Is there another way out? Mark asked, his voice trembling. Zira didn't answer immediately. She was scanning the valley, her eyes flicking from one shadow to the next. There is one way, she said, her voice low. But it's dangerous. The hunters will never stop looking for us. But if we use it, we might just make it. Mark's mind raced. Dangerous. What was she talking about? Where? He asked quickly. Without a word, Zira grabbed his wrist again and began to pull him toward the far edge of the valley. Mark didn't have time to ask any more questions. He could hear the hunters getting closer, their voices low but unmistakable. Zira led him to a large ancient tree near the edge of the valley. Its roots twisted into the ground in strange patterns, forming a kind of natural doorway. The tree looked ordinary at first glance, but Zira's eyes glowed with understanding as she stepped toward it. This is the way, she said. Follow me. Mark hesitated for a moment, then followed her without a second thought. He had no other choice. Mark's heart raced as Zira led him toward the ancient tree. The sounds of the hunters grew louder, their voices now clearly audible as they searched the valley. He could almost hear the mechanical hum of their technology as they moved through the forest, closing in on them with every passing moment. Zira's grip on his wrist tightened, and she pushed him forward. Hurry, she urged, her voice filled with urgency. We don't have much time. Mark looked around, the pressure of the hunters drawing closer. His chest tightened, and his legs burned with exhaustion. But there was no choice. If they didn't act now, they would be caught. He followed Zira to the base of the massive tree, where the twisted roots formed a small archway. Zira crouched down and placed her hand on the rough bark of the tree, her fingers tracing an intricate pattern Mark couldn't understand. The ground beneath them seemed to shift, the earth giving way with a low, almost imperceptible tremor. Mark's eyes widened in disbelief as a hidden door in the roots of the tree slowly opened, revealing a dark passageway beyond. It's safe, Zira said, her voice low but firm. Come on. Mark hesitated only for a moment before following her through the opening. The moment they stepped inside, the door closed behind them with a soft, final thud, leaving them in total darkness. Mark could barely make out Zira's silhouette in front of him, but he trusted her. He had no choice but to. Where are we going? Mark asked, his voice sounding too loud in the silence of the tunnel. Underground, Zira answered. There's a network of tunnels beneath the forest. They'll never think to look for us here. Mark could hear her footsteps ahead, steady and sure, while he stumbled behind, trying to keep up. The tunnel was narrow, and the air was thick with the smell of earth. As they moved deeper, Mark noticed the walls of the tunnel were smooth, almost unnatural. It felt like the place had been carved or built long ago, far older than anything he had seen before. "How long have you known about this place?" Mark asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Zira didn't answer immediately. She paused, her head tilting slightly as if listening for something. Mark stood still, waiting. "This place has been hidden for centuries," she said at last, her voice echoing in the stillness. "I've been searching for it for a long time. It's the only way to stop them." Mark frowned, trying to piece together everything she had told him. "The hunters, they're after you because of this place, right? What's so important about it?" Zira turned to him, her eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. "It's not just a refuge, it's a key. The hunters have been after it for as long as I can remember. They want to control it, use it for their own gain." Mark's mind raced, trying to understand. "So, you're trying to stop them from taking this place?" Zira nodded, her expression hardening. "Yes, but it's not just about stopping them. It's about keeping it hidden. If they get their hands on it, everything will change. Everything will be lost." Mark could feel the weight of her words sinking in. The forest, the strange valley, the hidden tunnels, it was all connected to something bigger, something that he didn't fully understand yet. "Do you know what they want to do with it?" Mark asked, his voice quiet. Zira paused again, her face serious. "I don't know everything, but I know enough. They're looking for something buried deep beneath this forest, something powerful, and they'll stop at nothing to find it." Mark felt a chill run down his spine. The thought of something powerful hidden beneath the forest made him uneasy. What if the hunters found it first? What if they could use it for something horrible? Zira's voice broke through his thoughts. "We're close." Mark looked ahead, trying to see through the darkness, but it was impossible to make out any details. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, the walls growing colder the further they went. He had no idea where they were headed, but he followed Zira without question. She was the only one who seemed to know what to do, and he trusted her more than he could explain. After what felt like an eternity, the tunnel opened up into a large underground chamber. The air was thick with the scent of damp stone and earth. In the center of the chamber was a pedestal, old and weathered, but still standing strong. The walls were covered in strange markings that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. "This is it," Zira said, her voice filled with awe and fear. Mark's gaze swept across the chamber, taking in the sight of the pedestal. It looked like it had been untouched for centuries, the markings on the walls older than anything he had ever seen. But what was it? What was so important about this place? "This is the key," Zira continued, her voice almost reverent. "This is where everything begins and ends." Mark didn't understand. "What is it? What does it do?" Zira didn't answer immediately. She walked toward the pedestal, her fingers brushing against the strange markings on the walls. As she did, a low hum filled the air, vibrating through the floor beneath them. "It's a power," Zira said, her voice shaking. "The hunters are looking for it. They think they can control it, but they don't understand it. If they unlock it—" Zira trailed off, her eyes wide with fear. Mark could feel the weight of her words, the deep sense of dread that filled the room. Whatever this place was, whatever the hunters were after, it was more dangerous than anything they could imagine. "We have to protect it," Zira whispered. "We can't let them find it." Mark looked at the pedestal, his heart pounding in his chest. It was clear now. This wasn't just a fight for survival. This was a fight for something far greater than either of them could understand. The chamber hummed with an ancient energy, the vibrations from the pedestal filling the air. Mark felt it deep in his chest, a subtle pull that seemed to call to something inside him. He looked at Zira, who stood by the pedestal, her face pale and tense. She was no longer just a girl in the woods to him. She was someone with a purpose, someone who was trying to protect something far bigger than either of them could understand. "Zira, what exactly is this place?" Mark asked, his voice quiet but full of urgency. What are they after? Zira didn't look at him. Her gaze was locked on the pedestal, her fingers trembling as they hovered just above the surface of the stone. It's a key, Mark, she said, her voice filled with a quiet fear. A key to something powerful. If the hunters find it, they'll control everything. They'll use it to reshape the world in their image. Mark's mind raced. A key to something powerful. That was what the hunters were after. But why did Zira want to keep it hidden? What could it unlock that was so dangerous? Before he could ask more questions, a distant sound reached his ears. The faint but unmistakable crack of branches breaking. The hunters were close. They had found the entrance to the underground chamber. Zira's eyes flicked toward him, her expression hardening. We don't have much time, she said. They're coming. Mark's heart skipped a beat. He glanced toward the entrance to the chamber, trying to see if there was any way out. But the tunnel behind them was dark, and there was no sign of escape. The only way forward was the pedestal. We have to stop them, Zira, Mark said, determination filling his voice. We can't let them get to it. Zira nodded, but her face was filled with sorrow. I don't know how much longer I can protect it. The hunters are strong, but we have to try. They both turned toward the pedestal, the ancient markings glowing brighter with each passing second. The air seemed to crackle with energy, and Mark could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This was it, the final stand. Suddenly, the chamber's entrance shook as something slammed against the stone walls. The hunters were here. Mark stepped closer to Zira, his heart pounding. What do we do now? He asked. Zira's hand hovered over the pedestal. We activate it, she said. We have to unlock its power before they do. Mark frowned, confusion clouding his thoughts. Unlock it. How do we do that? I don't know, Zira said, her voice tight with frustration. But we have no choice. We either unlock it or they do. And if they do, it will be the end of everything. Before Mark could ask more questions, the ground shook again, louder this time. The hunters were closer, and Mark could hear their footsteps echoing down the tunnel. Zira took a deep breath and placed both hands on the pedestal. The markings on the walls began to glow brighter, and the hum grew louder. The power in the air was undeniable, a force that seemed to stretch beyond the limits of the chamber. Mark stood at her side, his eyes wide with awe. The chamber felt alive with energy, the air thick with the unknown. He couldn't explain what was happening, but he knew they had to succeed. The sound of the hunter's footsteps was growing louder, closer. Mark's pulse quickened as he glanced toward the entrance. They had to move fast. Suddenly, the air around them exploded with a blinding light. Mark instinctively shielded his eyes as the power surged, crackling through the chamber. Zira's hands glowed with a bright, blue light, her face determined as she concentrated on the pedestal. The walls shook with the force of the energy, and then, with a final burst of light, the chamber went silent. Mark opened his eyes and blinked, disoriented. The glowing markings on the walls had vanished, and the pedestal had stopped humming. For a moment, everything seemed still. What happened? Mark whispered, his voice trembling. Zira looked up at him, her eyes wide with shock and fear. I don't know, she whispered. It's not supposed to stop. The power should have been unlocked, but before she could finish, the sound of footsteps echoed from the entrance. The hunters had reached the chamber. Mark's heart raced. We have to get out of here, he said urgently, grabbing Zira's arm. But Zira stood still, staring at the pedestal. It's too late. They'll find us no matter where we go. Mark's mind raced. There had to be another way. They couldn't just give up. Not after everything they had been through. We don't have to give up, Mark said, his voice firm. We have one last chance. We've got to fight. Zira's eyes snapped to his, surprise flashing across her face. For a moment, Mark thought she would argue, but instead she nodded. You're right. We have one shot left. Together, They turned to face the entrance, ready to defend the pedestal, ready to protect the secret they had uncovered. As the first of the hunters appeared in the doorway, Mark's body tensed, and Zira stepped forward, her eyes burning with a fierce determination. "We will stop them," she said, her voice filled with a quiet strength. "We'll stop them together." With that, the final battle began.